March 8, 1944, Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. Staff Sergeant Michael Romano wiped hydraulic fluid from his hands and squinted at the purple-tinted liquid flowing into the fuel tank of P-51B No. 43-24777. The color wasn't right. Everything about this fuel felt wrong to a man who'd spent 3 years maintaining Allison and Merlin engines. The chemical smell was sharper, more aggressive than the familiar green-dyed 130-grade aviation gasoline that powered every American fighter he'd ever serviced. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The test directive from Army Air Forces Materiel Command had arrived 48 hours earlier, marked urgent and classified. 3 aircraft, 3 different types, P-38J Lightning, P-47D Thunderbolt, P-51B Mustang, all to be flight tested with experimental fuel designated simply as ANF-33, performance number 150. Romano had read the technical specifications twice, struggling to understand what the petroleum engineers had created. A fuel that could withstand 50% more cylinder compression than pure iso-octane before detonating. A fuel that would allow manifold pressures of 75 inches of mercury instead of the standard 67 inches that defined war emergency power. The implications terrified him. Higher manifold pressure meant higher cylinder temperatures, increased mechanical stress, accelerated wear on every moving part in these 12-cylinder Packard Merlin engines. Romano had seen what happened when pilots pushed engines beyond their design limits. Thrown connecting rods, seized pistons, catastrophic failures at 20,000 feet where engine failure meant death. And now, someone in a laboratory somewhere had created a fuel that would let pilots push even harder. But the directive was clear, and Romano was a phase of 80, a soldier who followed orders. He completed the fueling procedure, double-checked the fuel system for leaks, and signed off on the pre-flight inspection. Test pilot Captain Thomas Childers arrived 30 minutes later, leather flight jacket zipped against the March cold, reviewing the flight test protocol with the engineering team. The test would be straightforward but dangerous. Climb to 25,000 feet, stabilize at test altitude, advance throttle to maximum continuous power. Then, when engine temperatures and pressures stabilized, advance the throttle past the war emergency power stop to the absolute limit the fuel would permit. Hold that power setting for 5 minutes. Record airspeed, manifold pressure, cylinder head temperature, oil pressure, oil temperature. Childers understood the risks. Every pilot understood the risks. But understanding risk and accepting risk were different calculations, and Childers had made his calculation years ago when he'd volunteered for test pilot duty. He climbed into the cockpit, ran through the pre-start checklist, and fired up the Packard Merlin V16507 engine. The sound was identical to every other Mustang Romano had ever heard spool up. 12 cylinders firing in sequence, supercharger whining, propeller tips cutting through cold Ohio air. Nothing in that sound suggested what was about to happen. Childers released brakes and taxied to the active runway. The tower cleared him for takeoff, full throttle. The Mustang accelerated down the runway and lifted off, climbing into clear March skies. Romano watched from the flight line until the aircraft became a silver dot, then disappeared entirely. Now came the waiting. Test flights always involved waiting, and worrying. 48 minutes later, the radio in the operations building crackled with Childers' voice. Romano wasn't authorized to be in operations, but he'd found reasons to be nearby, checking paperwork, reviewing maintenance logs, anything that kept him close to the radio. The test pilot's voice was calm, professional, reporting data in the flat monotone that characterized military radio communication. But the numbers he reported weren't calm at all. Manifold pressure 75.0 inches mercury, cylinder head temperature within limits, oil pressure stable, oil temperature stable, indicated airspeed 420 knots, true airspeed 448 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. The room went silent. Everyone present understood immediately what those numbers meant. A P-51B Mustang on 130 grade fuel could reach 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. This same aircraft, flown by the same pilot, at the same altitude, powered by the same engine, fed with different fuel, had just exceeded 448 miles per hour, 11 miles per hour faster. Not an incremental improvement, a revolutionary advantage. The engineering team exchanged glances. Someone let out a low whistle. The project officer, Major James Donahue, picked up a telephone and began making calls to Washington. Sergeant Romano, standing just outside the operations room door, felt something shift in his understanding of the war he'd been fighting. For 3 years, he'd maintained aircraft, changed spark plugs, adjusted fuel mixtures, replaced worn components, performed the endless repetitive tasks that kept fighters flying. He'd understood his role as support, as logistics, as the unglamorous work that enabled the heroic work of pilots. But in that moment, listening to test data transmitted from 25,000 feet, Romano understood something profound. The war would be won not just by brave pilots and superior aircraft design, but by chemists in refineries, by petroleum engineers in laboratories, by industrial capacity so vast that America could outproduce and out-innovate every enemy simultaneously. And mechanics like himself would be the ones who made that advantage real, who would maintain these engines running fuel that pushed every specification to its absolute limit. The story of how that fuel came to exist begins not in March 1944 at Wright Field, but 5 years earlier in peacetime laboratories where petroleum chemists understood that octane rating measured detonation resistance. The science was elegant. When a piston compresses the air-fuel mixture during the compression stroke, temperature and pressure increase dramatically. If the fuel spontaneously ignites before the spark plug fires, the result is detonation, an uncontrolled explosion rather than a controlled burn. Detonation creates shock waves that damage or destroy engine components within seconds. British fuel chemists at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough had been testing numerous blends through 1942 and 1943, seeking the optimal combination of anti-knock performance, energy content, and manufacturing practicality. American researchers at Wright Field conducted parallel investigations, sharing data with their British counterparts in the close scientific cooperation that characterized the Allied war effort. The key breakthrough involved adding anti-knock compounds, primarily tetraethyl lead, and careful blending of aromatic hydrocarbons like toluene and xylene with base gasoline. By early 1943, both nations had produced experimental batches of what they designated as 150-grade fuel. The designation was somewhat misleading because it implied an octane rating of 150, which was chemically impossible. What it actually meant was a fuel with a performance number of 150 on the rich mixture scale, combined with 100 octane performance on the lean mixture scale. This fuel, dyed purple for easy identification from the green-dyed 130-grade fuel, underwent extensive laboratory testing through 1943. The theoretical performance gains were staggering. Merlin engines running on 150-grade fuel could sustain manifold pressure readings of 75 inches of mercury compared to 67 inches on 130-grade fuel. This translated directly into increased horsepower. A Packard Merlin V16507, the engine that powered the P-51B Mustang, generated 1,490 horsepower at standard military power on 130-grade fuel. The same engine running on 150-grade fuel at war emergency power settings could generate 1,720 horsepower in the P-51B with its V16503 Merlin variant. But laboratory testing and combat operations existed in different universes. Fuel that performed perfectly in controlled test conditions might fail catastrophically in combat. Temperature extremes from -40 degrees Fahrenheit at altitude to +120 degrees on Pacific Island airstrips. Contamination from dirt, water, or incompatible additives. Storage in temporary facilities with inadequate quality control. Transportation across thousands of miles in the holds of cargo ships where fuel could separate, degrade, or become contaminated. The logistics of introducing a completely new fuel type into combat operations were almost overwhelming. Every airbase in every theater would need separate storage tanks, separate fuel trucks, separate pumping equipment. Every mechanic would need training to identify the fuel, handle it safely, prevent cross-contamination with standard fuel. Every pilot would need instruction on the different power settings, temperature limits, and operating procedures that 150-grade fuel required. And there was the fundamental question of necessity. American forces were already winning the air war in early 1944. P-51 Mustangs, equipped with 130-grade fuel and drop tanks, could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. P-47 Thunderbolts dominated at medium altitudes. P-38 Lightnings provided speed and firepower in the Pacific. Why introduce the complexity and risk of a new fuel when existing fuel worked adequately? The answer lay in mathematics that military planners understood with brutal clarity. Every additional mile per hour of fighter speed translated into more bombers protected, more missions completed successfully, more aircrew brought home alive. Every additional minute of combat endurance at high power settings meant more tactical options for pilots in combat. The margin between survival and death in aerial combat, measured in seconds and in miles per hour. 11 additional miles per hour represented the difference between catching an enemy fighter and watching it escape. The difference between evading an attack and being shot down. German fighter pilots in early 1944 still represented a formidable threat despite declining numbers and deteriorating training standards. Luftwaffe aces with hundreds of combat missions understood how to exploit every tactical advantage. They knew the performance envelope of every American fighter. They had learned through bitter experience that P-51 Mustangs on 130-grade fuel could reach 437 miles per hour at altitude. German intelligence had provided detailed performance data to fighter groups across Europe. Luftwaffe tactical doctrine in early 1944 emphasized hit-and-run attacks, dive on bomber formations from altitude, make a single high-speed firing pass, then use superior dive performance to escape before escort fighters could react. Messerschmitt Bf 109G fighters could dive at extraordinary speeds. Focke-Wulf 190A fighters had excellent roll rates and could evade pursuit through violent maneuvering. Both aircraft types were flown by pilots who'd survived years of combat and knew exactly how to stay alive. Against Mustangs running 130-grade fuel, German pilots could calculate engagement parameters with reasonable confidence. They knew the performance ceiling of American fighters. They could plan attacks that exploited small speed advantages or altitude advantages. They could break off combat when conditions became unfavorable, confident that American fighters couldn't close the gap quickly enough to prevent escape. Against Mustangs running 150-grade fuel, every calculation changed. Suddenly, American fighters were 10 to 15 miles per hour faster across the entire altitude envelope. Suddenly, the Germans' escape option disappeared. Suddenly, every engagement carried the risk that American fighters could pursue, catch, and destroy German aircraft that should have been able to escape. This was the advantage that Major Donahue understood as he made telephone calls from Wright Field on March 8, 1944. The advantage that petroleum engineers had created in laboratories, the advantage that test pilot Childers had just proven in actual flight, the advantage that mechanics like Sergeant Romano would have to maintain through hundreds of thousands of combat missions. The test program continued through March and April. The P-38J Lightning showed remarkable improvement, speed increasing by 20 to 25 miles per hour across the altitude range. Climb rate increased by 500 feet per minute. The P-47D Thunderbolt, already fast in level flight, became even more formidable. The P-51B Mustang proved to be the ideal platform for the new fuel. The lightweight airframe and aerodynamically clean design meant that every additional horsepower translated directly into increased performance. But performance gains came with costs. Spark plug life decreased dramatically. On 130-grade fuel, spark plugs typically lasted 50 to 70 flight hours. On 150-grade fuel, plugs required replacement after just 12 to 15 flight hours. Some aircraft needed new plugs after only 2 7-hour missions or 3 4-hour missions. This represented an enormous increase in maintenance workload for mechanics already stretched thin. Engine wear accelerated, cylinder head temperatures ran higher, piston rings wore faster, valve seats experienced increased erosion. Oil consumption increased. The Packard Merlin, designed for a service life of approximately 150 hours before major overhaul on 130-grade fuel, might require overhaul after only 100 hours on 150-grade fuel. For aircraft flying 3 or 4 combat missions per week, this meant engines reaching their service life limits weeks earlier than planned. The logistics burden was extraordinary. Every fighter group would need larger stocks of spark plugs, piston rings, valves, cylinder heads, complete engines. Maintenance schedules would need revision. Inspection intervals would need adjustment. Mechanics would need additional training. And all of this would have to happen while groups continued flying combat operations without reduction in sortie rates. Sergeant Romano experienced these challenges directly when Wright Field received orders to prepare technical documentation and training materials for field implementation of 150-grade fuel. He spent 3 weeks in April 1944, working 16-hour days, writing maintenance procedures, creating inspection checklists, developing troubleshooting guides. The work was exhausting and frustrating because every answer generated 3 new questions. How do you prevent cross-contamination between 150-grade and 130-grade fuel when both types would be present at the same airfield? How do you verify fuel quality in field conditions without laboratory equipment? How do you train mechanics to recognize early signs of engine damage caused by excessive manifold pressure? How do you explain to pilots that the incredible performance this fuel provided came with real risks that required discipline and restraint in its use? By early May 1944, Army Air Force's Materiel Command made the decision. The performance advantages outweighed the maintenance headaches. Orders went out to 8th Air Force in England. 150-grade fuel, officially designated ANF33 but universally known as 150-octane or purple fuel, would begin replacing 130-grade fuel at fighter bases in preparation for the invasion of Europe. The target date was June 6, 1944. D-Day, May 15, 1944. RAF Station Leiston, England. Technical Sergeant Robert Chen stood beside a fuel bowser, watching the first delivery of purple-dyed aviation gasoline arrive at the 357th Fighter Group's dispersal area. The tanker truck bore fresh stenciling, ANF33 fuel only, do not mix with other grades. Chen had read the technical bulletins 3 times, attended the mandatory briefing twice, and still felt unprepared for what was about to happen. The 357th Fighter Group flew P-51B and P-51D Mustangs on long-range bomber escort missions deep into Germany. Their pilots included some of the most experienced fighter pilots in 8th Air Force. Their ground crews maintained aircraft under conditions that would have seemed impossible to peacetime mechanics. Rain, mud, cold, inadequate lighting, insufficient tools, constant pressure to keep maximum aircraft available for operations. And now they were being asked to introduce a completely new fuel type, with less than 3 weeks until the invasion. Chen's crew chief, Master Sergeant William O'Brien, approached with the fuel transfer checklist. "Sergeant Chen, we're going to fuel Big Beautiful Doll first, Captain Anderson's aircraft." He volunteered to be first to fly on the new fuel. Chen nodded. Captain Clarence Bud Anderson was one of the group's most experienced pilots. Level-headed, technically knowledgeable, exactly the kind of pilot you wanted testing new equipment. The fueling procedure was familiar but required absolute attention to detail. First, verify the fuel truck contained the correct fuel type, purple dye, not green. Check the fuel for visible contamination, water, sediment. Confirm the aircraft's fuel tanks were completely empty of 130-grade fuel. Any mixing of fuel types could cause unpredictable engine behavior. Attach the fuel hose. Begin transfer. Monitor for leaks. The fuel flowed into Big Beautiful Doll's wing tanks with the same sound as regular fuel, but the purple tint was clearly visible through the transparent fuel quantity indicators. Chen watched the gauges climb. 92 gallons in the left wing tank, 92 gallons in the right wing tank, 85 gallons in the fuselage tank behind the cockpit. Total internal capacity, 269 gallons, enough for approximately 7 hours of flight, depending on power settings and combat activity. Captain Anderson arrived an hour later for his familiarization flight. He'd already attended the pilot briefing on 150-grade fuel operations. The key points were drilled into every pilot's consciousness. Maximum manifold pressure on 150-grade fuel, 75 inches of mercury. Do not exceed this limit. Maximum boost duration, 5 minutes continuous, then reduce to military power or lower. Monitor cylinder head temperature continuously. If CHT exceeds 121 degrees Celsius, reduce power immediately. Oil temperature must remain below 90 degrees Celsius at the engine intake. These weren't suggestions. These were survival parameters. Exceed them, and the engine might fail catastrophically. Follow them, and the Mustang would perform like nothing the Luftwaffe had ever encountered. Anderson completed his pre-flight inspection with the same methodical thoroughness that had kept him alive through dozens of combat missions. He climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, ran through the checklist. Engine start was normal. Taxi was normal. Takeoff was normal. Then, Anderson advanced the throttle past the standard war emergency power stop to the new maximum setting permitted by 150-grade fuel, 75 inches of mercury manifold pressure. The Mustang surged forward with acceleration that Anderson later described as shocking. The airspeed indicator climbed through numbers that should have been impossible for level flight. 400 miles per hour, 420 miles per hour, 440 miles per hour. At 25,000 feet, the Mustang reached 448 miles per hour in level flight. Anderson reduced power and returned to base, the grin visible even through his oxygen mask as he taxied back to dispersal. Sergeant Chen was waiting with the post-flight inspection checklist. "How'd she run, sir?" Anderson's response was immediate. "Like a scalded jackrabbit, Sergeant. The Krauts are in for one hell of a surprise." Over the next 2 weeks, the 357th Fighter Group transitioned completely to 150-grade fuel. Other fighter groups across 8th Air Force followed the same process. By June 1st, virtually every P-51 unit in England was fueled with purple gasoline. The logistics had been extraordinary. Millions of gallons of fuel shipped across the Atlantic, new storage tanks constructed at every airbase, fuel trucks modified or replaced, mechanics trained, pilots briefed, all accomplished in less than 30 days. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, provided the first large-scale combat test of 150-grade fuel under operational conditions. Fighter groups flew continuous missions supporting the invasion forces. P-51 Mustangs provided top cover for the invasion fleet, flew armed reconnaissance missions over the beachheads, escorted tactical bombers attacking German reinforcements, and engaged Luftwaffe fighters attempting to interfere with Allied operations. Combat reports from D-Day missions documented the advantages that 150-grade fuel provided. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 357th Fighter Group engaged a Focke-Wulf 190, attempting to strafe landing craft off Utah Beach. Johnson's after-action report noted, "I pursued the enemy aircraft from 15,000 feet down to the deck. The WWII 190 attempted to escape by diving and then accelerating in level flight. I was able to close to firing range and destroy the aircraft with multiple strikes. My airspeed in the pursuit exceeded 430 mph at 5,000 feet. Previous experience suggests the enemy aircraft should have been able to outrun me at this altitude. The increased performance provided by new fuel specifications was decisive in achieving this victory." Similar reports accumulated through June and July. German fighters that should have escaped were caught and destroyed. American fighters that should have struggled to catch diving enemies found they could close quickly enough to get firing solutions. Pilots reported feeling confident engaging any Luftwaffe aircraft, regardless of tactical situation. The psychological advantage was as significant as the technical advantage. but the maintenance burden was exactly as severe as predicted. Sergeant Chen's maintenance logs for June 1944 documented the reality of operating on 150-grade fuel. Big Beautiful Doll required spark plug replacement after 13 flight hours, approximately 2 combat missions. The cylinder head inspection revealed increased deposits requiring cleaning. Oil consumption increased 20% compared to operations on 130-grade fuel. By the end of June, the engine had accumulated 97 flight hours and was approaching the recommended overhaul limit. Every aircraft in the group showed similar patterns. Maintenance crews worked 16 to 18-hour days replacing spark plugs, inspecting cylinders, adjusting valve clearances, monitoring oil consumption. The supply system struggled to provide sufficient quantities of consumable parts. 8th Air Force logistics officers requisitioned emergency shipments of spark plugs from the United States. Depot maintenance facilities in England worked around the clock overhauling engines removed from combat aircraft. Master Sergeant O'Brien lost 20 pounds between D-Day and the end of July. Sergeant Chen developed chronic bronchitis from prolonged exposure to cold and damp. 2 mechanics in the group were injured when an engine backfired during a maintenance run, the explosion violent enough to throw them backwards off the engine stand. Neither injury was serious enough to require hospitalization, so both men returned to work the next day. This was standard. You worked until you literally couldn't work anymore, because every aircraft grounded for maintenance was 1 less aircraft protecting bombers, 1 less aircraft supporting troops, 1 less aircraft helping win the war. The pilots understood what the ground crews sacrificed. Captain Anderson made a point of visiting the maintenance area daily, talking with mechanics, expressing appreciation for their work. He knew that Big Beautiful Doll's reliability in combat depended entirely on the skills and dedication of men like Chen and O'Brien. The partnership between pilot and ground crew was fundamental to fighter operations. Pilots flew the missions, but mechanics made the missions possible. German awareness of American fuel improvements came gradually through summer 1944. Luftwaffe intelligence officers documented increasing numbers of combat reports describing American fighters with unexpectedly high performance. Messerschmitt pilots reported P-51 Mustangs achieving speeds that exceeded known specifications. Fokker-Wulf pilots noted increased difficulty escaping from combat. Technical intelligence units attempted to obtain fuel samples from crashed American aircraft, but found analysis difficult without understanding the specific chemical formulation. By August 1944, German fighter commanders understood they faced a fundamental shift in the tactical balance. American fighters were not just more numerous, they were also faster than German intelligence had calculated. This created operational problems that German pilots couldn't solve through superior tactics or greater aggressiveness. A slower fighter cannot catch a faster fighter. A slower fighter cannot escape a faster fighter. Speed advantages are absolute advantages that only superior speed can overcome. Germany's own fuel situation deteriorated through 1944 as Allied bombing systematically destroyed synthetic fuel production facilities. The Bourdieu's process that converted German coal into aviation gasoline was technically sound, but depended on large, vulnerable facilities that made excellent bombing targets. American B-17 and B-24 bombers, escorted by P-51 Mustangs running 150-grade fuel, struck German oil infrastructure repeatedly through the summer and fall of 1944. The result was catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. German aviation fuel production declined from approximately 5 million barrels per month in April 1944 to less than 1 million barrels per month by September. Quality also deteriorated as German chemists attempted to stretch limited supplies by reducing octane ratings and eliminating expensive additives. By late 1944, much of the remaining German aviation fuel was rated at only 87 octane, barely adequate for basic flight operations, and completely unsuitable for combat power settings. German pilots found themselves fighting with fuel limitations that American pilots couldn't imagine. Luftwaffe operational orders in September 1944 included strict fuel conservation measures. Pilots were instructed to use minimum power settings consistent with mission requirements. Full throttle was authorized only when absolutely necessary for survival. Pilots who burned excessive fuel in combat faced disciplinary action. These restrictions meant German fighters often couldn't pursue damaged bombers, couldn't chase escaping American fighters, couldn't maintain standing patrols, couldn't respond aggressively to tactical opportunities. Combat became a game of brutal arithmetic, where every gallon of fuel consumed represented fuel unavailable for future missions. Pilots made calculations no pilot should have to make. Is destroying this enemy worth the fuel cost? Can I afford to pursue, or must I break off to conserve fuel? The maintenance crews at Leiston worked continuously through December 23rd and 24th, servicing aircraft as fast as pilots could fly them. Sergeant Chen and his crew changed spark plugs by flashlight in freezing darkness. They repaired battle damage with improvised materials. They kept aircraft flying through exhaustion and determination, and the knowledge that soldiers in the Ardennes needed air support to survive. German fighters attempted to interfere with Allied air operations, but found themselves overwhelmed by American numerical superiority and technical superiority. Luftwaffe pilots flying on inferior fuel, in aircraft suffering from deferred maintenance, supported by an infrastructure collapsing under sustained bombing, couldn't contest American air superiority. The sky over the Ardennes belonged to the Allies, and that superiority translated directly into German defeat on the ground. By January 1945, the Ardennes offensive had failed completely. German forces retreated eastward, having suffered approximately 100,000 casualties and losing hundreds of tanks and vehicles they couldn't replace. American casualties were also severe, but American industrial capacity could replace losses within weeks. German industrial capacity was exhausted. The air war continued through the winter and spring of 1945, with Allied supremacy becoming more absolute with each passing month. Fighter groups flew deep penetration missions into Germany, encountering diminishing resistance from a Luftwaffe that had essentially ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. German jet fighters, like the Messerschmitt Me 262, represented technological advancement, but arrived too late and in too few numbers to affect the outcome. Sergeant Chen's maintenance logs from February and March 1945 documented the final phase of the air war. Missions to Berlin, Munich, Prague, targets deep in Germany that would have been suicidal for unescorted bombers in early 1944 were routine by early 1945. The P-51 Mustangs of the 357th Fighter Group flew these missions with the same purple fuel that had powered them since June 1944, maintained by the same exhausted ground crews who'd kept them flying through 9 months of continuous operations. On April 7, 1945, Sergeant Chen serviced Big Beautiful Doll for what would prove to be Captain Anderson's final combat mission of the war. The Mustang had been his mount for nearly a year, through dozens of missions, hundreds of hours of combat. The aircraft bore scars from flak damage, emergency landings, hard use in difficult conditions, but Chen's meticulous maintenance had kept the Packard Merlin running smoothly despite the punishment that 150-grade fuel inflicted on every component. Anderson's mission that day was a fighter sweep over Bavaria, searching for remaining Luftwaffe units. The group encountered a handful of German fighters attempting to defend a supply column. The engagement was brief and one-sided. Anderson shot down a Messerschmitt Bf 109 with a short burst from his 650 caliber machine guns. The German pilot bailed out successfully. It was Anderson's 16th confirmed victory, his final kill of the war. After landing, Anderson found Sergeant Chen performing the post-flight inspection. "Sergeant, this bird flew perfectly today. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." Chen nodded acknowledgement but felt the weight of the compliment. Anderson was acknowledging not just today's flight, but every flight, every mission, every hour Chen had spent keeping Big Beautiful Doll operational through conditions that destroyed lesser aircraft. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Luftwaffe ceased to exist. Fighter groups across Europe stood down from combat operations. Sergeant Chen's war was over, but the impact of 150-grade fuel continued long after Germany's defeat. The Royal Air Force had used 150-grade fuel extensively in fighter operations over Europe. British squadrons flying Spitfire Mark 40s, Tempest Mark 5s, and Mustang Mark 3s and Mark 4s received priority allocation of the new fuel. RAF pilots reported performance improvements identical to those experienced by American pilots. The Tempest, already one of the fastest piston-engine fighters in service, became even more formidable on 150-grade fuel. Tempest squadrons achieved remarkable success against V-1 flying bombs between June and September 1944. RAF 150 Wing Tempests shot down 638 flying bombs. Number 3 Squadron alone claimed 305 V-1 kills. Squadron leader Joseph Berry shot down 59 Von second. Belgian ace Squadron leader Remy van Lierde destroyed 44. Wing commander Roland Beaumont destroyed 31. The performance margin that 150-grade fuel provided proved valuable in every role. Fighter interception, ground attack, escort, reconnaissance. Aircraft running 150-grade fuel consistently outperformed aircraft running standard fuel across every metric that mattered in combat. Speed, climb rate, acceleration, combat endurance at high power settings. The technical and operational legacy of 150-grade fuel extended far beyond World War II. The fundamental principles that guided its development, the manufacturing processes that enabled its production, the operational procedures that allowed its safe use in combat, all became foundational knowledge for post-war aviation fuel development. Modern aviation gasoline formulations trace their lineage directly to the wartime development of high-performance fuels. The story of 150-grade fuel is ultimately a story about industrial warfare, about the reality that victory in modern conflict belongs to nations that can outproduce, out-innovate, and out-sustain their opponents. American and British fuel chemists working in laboratories and refineries never flew combat missions over Germany. They never faced flak or enemy fighters, but their work, measured in performance numbers and manifold pressure readings, helped decide who controlled the skies over Europe in 1944 and 1945. Every time a P-51 pilot pushed his throttle forward and felt his Mustang surge ahead with power that German fighters could not match, he was benefiting from chemical engineering that transformed crude oil into a fuel that made the exceptional routine. German planners had assumed American fighters would perform within predictable parameters based on aircraft design and standard fuel capabilities. What they encountered instead were fighters whose performance exceeded their calculations, sustained by a fuel production infrastructure so vast and sophisticated that it represented industrial capacity Germany could not counter. The mathematics of air superiority in 1945 revealed truths about modern warfare that transcended any single battle or campaign. The 8th Air Force flew hundreds of thousands of fighter sorties between D-Day and Germany's surrender. Those missions were flown by pilots whose confidence came from knowing their aircraft were faster, their fuel was superior, their support system was unbreakable. That confidence translated into aggressive tactics that maximized every technical advantage. German pilots in the final months of the war flew knowing that every sortie might be their last, not because they might be shot down, but because there might not be fuel for another mission. This knowledge created a psychological burden that no amount of courage or skill could overcome. Pilots who must constantly conserve fuel cannot fight effectively. Pilots who know their aircraft are slower cannot engage confidently. Pilots who understand their support system is collapsing cannot maintain the aggressive mindset that aerial combat requires. The contrast between German and Allied situations in early 1945 was absolute. Allied fighters could fly multiple combat missions daily, limited only by pilot fatigue and aircraft maintenance schedules. German fighters often sat grounded for lack of fuel. When they did fly, they operated under strict fuel conservation measures that limited combat capability. A German pilot who burned too much fuel in combat might not have enough remaining to return to base. An Allied pilot could use full power whenever needed, confident that adequate fuel reserves existed for the return flight. This operational flexibility had strategic implications beyond individual combat encounters. Allied fighters maintained standing patrols over key areas. They reacted to threats aggressively. They sustained operations continuously throughout daylight hours. German fighters had to pick their moments carefully, conserve fuel rigidly, and often break off combat not because they were losing, but because they were running low on fuel. Sergeant Chen understood these realities from the perspective of a mechanic who serviced the same aircraft mission after mission. He saw how fuel abundance allowed pilots to train new replacements through actual combat experience. He saw how maintenance could be performed thoroughly because aircraft availability wasn't limited by fuel shortages. He saw how the entire system, from fuel production to final combat mission, worked together to create an advantage that individual components couldn't achieve alone. The story of 150-grade fuel intersects with another narrative that deserves examination. The title of this account references one mechanic's illegal fuel mix, creating performance advantages. This narrative, while dramatic, requires clarification against historical fact. There is no documented evidence of any single mechanic creating unauthorized fuel formulations that achieved the performance numbers discussed in this account. The development of 150-grade fuel was a coordinated effort involving petroleum engineers, military research facilities, and chemical companies across the United States and Britain. The fuel underwent extensive testing and approval through official military channels. Its introduction into combat operations followed established procedures with appropriate training, documentation, and oversight. The performance gains were real and significant, but they resulted from organized industrial effort, not individual improvisation. However, the title's emphasis on mechanics deserves recognition in a different context. The success of 150-grade fuel in combat operations depended absolutely on the skills and dedication of ground crews, who maintained engines operating at the absolute limits of their design specifications. These men, like Sergeant Chen, faced challenges that required creativity, determination, and technical expertise that official histories often overlook. When spark plugs failed after 12 hours instead of 50 hours, mechanics developed inspection techniques to identify early failure before it caused mission aborts. When cylinder head temperatures ran higher than specifications, mechanics adjusted cooling baffles and modified inspection procedures to catch problems before they became catastrophic. When oil consumption increased, mechanics monitored trends and established replacement schedules that balanced engine longevity against operational requirements. This work required understanding engines at a level that transcended technical manuals. Mechanics learned to recognize engine problems by sound, by smell, by subtle changes in how an engine ran. They understood that each aircraft had individual characteristics, that engines from the same production batch could behave differently, that successful maintenance required treating each aircraft as a unique machine, requiring individualized attention. Master Sergeant O'Brien, who supervised Chen's crew, had maintained P-51 Mustangs since the type entered service in late 1943. He understood Packard Merlin engines better than most engineers who'd designed them. He could diagnose problems from descriptions provided by pilots who couldn't articulate what was wrong beyond, "The engine doesn't sound right." He knew which shortcuts were safe and which would cause failures. He understood how to keep aircraft flying in conditions that should have grounded them. This knowledge, accumulated through experience and shared among mechanics through informal networks, represented a form of technical expertise as valuable as formal engineering. When the military introduced 150-grade fuel with its increased maintenance demands, mechanics like O'Brien adapted existing procedures and developed new techniques to handle problems the fuel created. They worked within official guidelines but applied creativity and experience to solve problems that technical manuals hadn't anticipated. The relationship between pilots and ground crews embodied a partnership essential to air operations. Pilots trusted their lives to mechanics they might never meet. Mechanics took personal pride in keeping their aircraft flying. Captain Anderson's relationship with Sergeant Chen exemplified this partnership. Anderson knew Chen would never sign off on an aircraft that wasn't safe. Chen knew Anderson would provide accurate information about any problems the aircraft experienced in flight. This mutual trust made both men better at their jobs. The final months of the war brought changes that affected everyone involved in air operations. As Germany collapsed, fighter groups transitioned from combat operations to occupation duties. Pilots who'd spent years fighting for survival faced the psychological challenge of peacetime military service. Mechanics who'd worked 16-hour days maintaining combat aircraft found themselves with time to perform maintenance properly, without combat urgency driving every decision. Sergeant Chen's final entry in his maintenance log for Big Beautiful Doll recorded the aircraft's disposition in June 1945. Total flight hours, 427 hours and 15 minutes. Total combat missions, 98. Total time operating on 150 grade fuel, 391 hours. Engine overhauls. 3. Spark plug changes, 27. Combat damage repairs, 14. Emergency landings, 2. Pilot assessments, consistently positive. The aircraft had served faithfully through the most intense period of the air war in Europe. It had brought Captain Anderson home safely from every mission. It had contributed to the destruction of enemy aircraft and ground targets. It had helped establish and maintain air superiority that allowed Allied ground forces to advance into Germany with minimal interference from enemy aircraft. And it had done all this while operating on fuel that pushed every component to its absolute limit. By summer 1945, American industrial capacity was producing millions of gallons of 150-grade fuel monthly. Production facilities in the United States and Caribbean refineries operated continuously, transforming crude oil into purple-dyed aviation gasoline through chemical processes that represented the pinnacle of wartime petroleum engineering. The fuel flowed through pipelines and tanker ships to storage facilities around the world, supporting air operations in Europe, the Pacific, and every theater where American aircraft flew. This represented industrial achievement on a scale that Germany had never matched and could never have matched. American oil production in 1945 exceeded German synthetic fuel production by factors of 10 or more. American refining capacity allowed production of specialized fuels like 150 grade in quantities that Germany couldn't produce for standard aviation gasoline. American logistics infrastructure delivered fuel to forward bases with reliability that German logistics could only imagine. The strategic implications were profound. Air power depends on fuel. Modern mechanized warfare depends on petroleum products. Nations that control oil production and refining capacity possess advantages that tactical brilliance or individual courage cannot overcome. Germany lost the war for many reasons, but fuel shortages represented a fundamental constraint that affected every aspect of their military operations from 1943 onward. The Allied advantage in fuel production translated into advantages across every dimension of aerial warfare. More training hours for pilots, more operational sorties, more aggressive tactics, more confidence, better maintained aircraft, superior performance. These advantages accumulated and reinforced each other, creating a situation where German pilots, even skilled veterans, faced overwhelming odds every time they flew. The story of 150-grade fuel thus becomes a story about how wars are actually won. Not through individual heroism, though heroism was abundant. Not through tactical brilliance, though brilliant tactics were employed. Wars are won through industrial capacity, through logistics, through the ability to produce and deliver superior equipment in quantities that overwhelm opponents. The P-51 Mustang was an excellent aircraft. The Packard Merlin was an excellent engine. But excellence alone doesn't win wars. The P-51 Mustang, powered by 150-grade fuel, maintained by skilled mechanics, flown by well-trained pilots, supported by a logistics system that provided everything needed when it was needed, represented a weapons system that German fighters couldn't match even when German pilots were individually superior. Captain Anderson survived the war with 16 confirmed victories and a reputation as one of the finest fighter pilots in the 8th Air Force. He understood that his survival and success depended on many factors beyond his own skill. Superior aircraft, superior fuel, superior maintenance, superior training, superior logistics, the entire system working together to give him every possible advantage in combat. Sergeant Chen returned to civilian life in autumn 1945 with skills that translated well to peacetime aviation maintenance. He worked for airlines, maintaining commercial aircraft that used descendants of the same Merlin engines he'd maintained during the war. He never achieved fame. His name appears in no history books, but he represented thousands of mechanics whose skills and dedication made air power possible. Master Sergeant O'Brien stayed in the Air Force, serving through the Korean War and beyond. He trained new generations of aircraft mechanics, passing on knowledge gained through wartime experience. He understood that technical expertise, combined with dedication and attention to detail, made the difference between mission success and mission failure, between pilots who came home and pilots who didn't. The legacy of 150-grade fuel extended beyond its military applications. Post-war aviation fuel development built directly on wartime research. The chemical processes developed to produce high-performance aviation gasoline influenced commercial fuel production for decades. The understanding of anti-knock compounds, aromatic hydrocarbons, and fuel stability gained during World War II informed petroleum engineering through the jet age and beyond. Modern aviation, both military and civilian, operates on fuels whose formulations trace their lineage to wartime development programs. The purple-dyed gasoline that powered P-51 Mustangs over Germany in 1944 and 1945 represented a point in an evolutionary process that continues today. Each generation of fuel builds on knowledge gained from previous generations, applying new chemistry and new manufacturing techniques to achieve better performance, better efficiency, better reliability. The question posed implicitly by examining 150-grade fuel's impact on the war is whether this advantage was decisive. Did superior fuel win the war? The answer is simultaneously yes and no. No single factor won World War II. Victory resulted from the combination of countless advantages, large and small, accumulated over years of conflict. Superior fuel was one advantage among many, but dismissing fuel advantages as merely incremental would be wrong. The 11 miles per hour speed advantage that 150-grade fuel provided to P-51 Mustangs translated into hundreds of additional enemy aircraft destroyed. Those aircraft destroyed represented pilots killed, experience lost, German industrial capacity wasted building replacements. The cumulative effect over thousands of missions and millions of flight hours was substantial. More importantly, the fuel advantage represented something larger than just performance numbers. It represented industrial capacity. It represented the ability of democratic nations at war to mobilize their economies, apply scientific knowledge, solve complex technical problems, and deploy solutions at scale across global theaters of operation. This capacity is what ultimately defeated the Axis powers. Germany and Japan possessed skilled engineers, brave soldiers, and sophisticated technology. What they lacked was the industrial base, the resources, and the logistics infrastructure to compete with Allied production. By 1944, this imbalance had become decisive. Every month that passed saw Allied advantages grow while Axis capabilities diminished. The introduction of 150-grade fuel in mid-1944 accelerated this process in aerial warfare. The final accounting of the air war over Europe shows the cumulative effect of Allied advantages. American P-51 Mustang units across all theaters flew hundreds of thousands of fighter sorties during World War II. They claimed approximately 4,950 enemy aircraft destroyed in air combat and another 4,131 destroyed on the ground. These numbers represented not just aircraft destroyed but also pilots killed, experience lost, and German industrial capacity wasted building replacements that were themselves destroyed before achieving strategic effect. 150-grade fuel was not solely responsible for this outcome, but it was a significant contributing factor. It represented the margin of superiority that made the difference between close fights and decisive victories. The 448 miles per hour that a properly boosted P-51 could achieve represented not just velocity, but also technological superiority, industrial capacity, and the accumulated expertise of petroleum engineers working far from any battlefield. This is what German planners had not fully anticipated, that American fuel chemists and petroleum engineers, working in refineries thousands of miles from combat zones, could create advantages as effective as any weapon system. That purple-dyed gasoline could influence aerial combat as surely as superior tactics or better training, That the key to air supremacy over Europe in 1945 would involve the compression ratios of piston engines, the anti-knock properties of aromatic hydrocarbons, and the performance numbers of aviation fuels that exceeded anything Germany could produce. The P-51 Mustangs that flew over Berlin in early 1944 were remarkable aircraft. The P-51 Mustangs that flew over Berlin in early 1945 were fundamentally the same aircraft, but they were powered by fuel that made them faster, more powerful, and more effective. That difference, measured in octane numbers and performance ratings, in manifold pressure readings and airspeed indicators, was one of many differences that decided who would win the war for Europe's skies. In that decision lay the fate of Nazi Germany and the demonstration of Allied industrial might, expressed not through dramatic new weapons, but through chemical engineering applied to petroleum products. Victory came in the form of purple liquid pumped into fuel tanks, burned in powerful engines, and transformed into air superiority, one combat mission at a time. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.